Everyone, right, let's talk about Sulston. There is news out today that he has died, so rest in peace, but this guy was an absolute legend in developmental biology and genetics. So let's talk a little bit about him and his history, but then also the fascinating story of the Human Genome Project and the race in the Human Genome Project between Sir John Sulston, who was absolutely for making all the information publicly available, and Craig Venter in the US, who set up his own company to race the Human Genome Project and wanted to cash in on it. So John Sulston did his degree, I think, in chemistry before going on to molecular biology and developmental biology at Cambridge, where his big breakthrough that he got the Nobel Prize for in 2002 was mapping out a nematode worm cell by cell. So this little worm has about 1,000 cells in it, and so in order to work out how it grows from a single egg, he basically did drawing after drawing after drawing through all the stages in order to map it through. And then it's through the use of that model organism that really supercharged developmental biology. And so he got the Nobel Prize for that in 2002. In 1992, I think it was, he founded and then became director of the Sanger Center, named after the famous biologist Fred Sanger, who won the Nobel Prize twice, I think. And that's got very involved in genetic efforts and mapping the genetics of the nematode worm, etc., etc. And then when the Human Genome Project started up in about 1996, then it was this Sanger Center that took up the British part of this transatlantic effort. Now, my PhD in genetics started in 1998 and went until 2003. And the Human Genome Project ran from about, 1996 to 2001, where the big publications came out resulting from it. So as I was a young PhD student, we were watching this race all the time, and it was fascinating because our own genetics work had to scale up in order to find all the genes associated with mental disorders and developmental biology and things like that. And the Human Genome Project was massive scale, and so it was fascinating to watch what was happening. Now here's what happened with the race. There was a scientist called Craig Venter, very brilliant scientist, but he absolutely shook the science world and more broadly when he announced at a science conference that he was going to be using this new genetic technology found by others to find genes and then patent the genes so that he would have the rights to them himself, basically commercializing nature. That caused an complete uproar and outrage, and that was shut down. But then when the Human Genome Project was running, the transatlantic effort mainly between the US and the UK, he thought in 1998 that it was going a bit too slowly. So he set up his own company called Celera, got some financial backing for it, and the aim was to race the Human Genome Project to get a sequence out before it. He thought he could get it out 3 years before. He was using a different sequencing method called shotgun sequencing, which was basically crude it in faster, but he thought he'd get it all out there first, and then it would be a paid access thing. So any biologists or companies that wanted to get access to the sequence would have to pay him. Whereas the Human Genome Project was a public effort. And in the UK, it was led by John Sulston. And John Sulston absolutely loathed the idea of people cashing in on genetics like this. He thought this is a public effort, this is all meant to be about public information so that we can all use it for furthering human health. There is no way I'm going to let this guy get away with this. Now here's the interesting thing. When Craig Venter announced that he was going to take on the Human Genome Project and race it with his own company, he didn't know that the Sanger Institute had just been talking to the Wellcome Trust about ramping up the funding so that they could do things faster. So within a few days or a week, that came through, and then the race was on. and it was all over the news. And then I think about 2 years later, in 2000, there was massive political pressure from Bill Clinton and Tony Blair at the time to get this resolved, to make it all work together. So in 2000, there were these big news conferences of Craig Venter and the head of the whole genome project, which was Francis Collins, coming together with the president and the prime minister, saying that they were we'd all won, both sides had won, and we're going to publish it together. And I think the public effort came out in Nature in 2001, which one of my colleagues was on. Because the philosophy of the Sanger Institute was everyone who'd done work in it, gets their name in the publication. So there was hundreds of authors, including one of my colleagues, just a PhD student, because he'd done some work on it. That was lovely. And then the private effort was published in Science. But anyway, the privatization of science and genetics was thwarted by the supercharged public effort and determined drive in order to make sure that it was all public and it was all for broader use. And John Sulston was an absolute champion in that. I remember at the time, that he was fiery about it. And because lots of people were scared of, where is genetic technology going if it's just going to be sold out to these big companies. But this was a big win for public science. And there you go. There's that story. I hope you enjoyed it. And catch you soon. And RIP John Sulston. What a difference he has made to the way that we do science and genetics today.